I stopped breathing when I saw her face. The little girl selling newspapers on the corner looked exactly like my ex-wife Elena. Not similar, not reminiscent, but identical in a way that made me question reality, made me wonder if grief had finally broken something fundamental in my brain, if 5 years of guilt and remorse had created hallucinations so vivid that I now saw ghosts in flesh and blood walking the streets of this city I had once shared with the woman I loved. She was 9, maybe 10 years old, with mud smeared across her cheek like a scar from war against poverty, and brown hair that caught the afternoon light in exactly the same way Elena's did when she would stand by the kitchen window of our old apartment washing dishes with slow deliberate movements and humming songs she never finished because she always got lost in her own thoughts, in her own internal worlds that I never learned how to reach. I stood there on the sidewalk in my $1,000 custom-made suit, feeling the familiar weight of my Swiss watch on my wrist and the Italian leather of my shoes against the cracked pavement, watching this child who had Elena's eyes, the same hazel color with the same golden flecks that used to sparkle when she laughed, the same eyes that had looked at me with love and then with disappointment and finally with nothing at all. Elena's smile slightly crooked to the left as if she were keeping a secret. Elena's way of tilting her head when she concentrated, biting her lower lip in a gesture so familiar that I felt time folding in on itself like a photograph someone creases in half. I felt the world tilt on its axis, felt 5 years of carefully constructed emotional walls built brick by brick, pane by pane, crumble in an instant like a house of cards in a storm. The girl was selling newspapers outside the subway entrance blue line, where the acrid smell of urine and exhaust mixed with the cloying sweetness of overripe fruit from the Guatemalan vendor's cart who had been on that corner every day for the past 3 years, according to my driver, who knew every detail of this route because I took it religiously every morning on my way to my office in the financial district. People pushed past her as if she were invisible, as if she were nothing but another piece of urban debris that the city had forgotten to clean. Executives in gray suits and women in high heels and students with heavy backpacks, all absorbed in their phones, in their lives, in their problems that were so small compared to this girl's, but that consumed all their attention, all their energy, all their capacity to see the suffering that surrounded them. But she wasn't invisible to me. She was impossible to ignore, with her small ink-stained hands folding newspapers with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, each fold perfect, each movement economical without wasting energy, because every second counted. Every newspaper sold meant food on the table or medicine for someone sick, or maybe just the difference between sleeping on the street or in a bed. Her voice rose above the traffic noise, calling out to passers-by in the same musical cadence, the same tone that rose and fell like a sad song, the same quality that had made me fall in love with Elena 7 years ago when I met her in a bookstore in the Latin Quarter where she worked weekends to pay for her art studies, and I pretended interest in poetry just to have an excuse to talk to her. This was impossible, and yet it was happening before my eyes. Elena and I had never had children together. We had lost our only pregnancy in the 7th month when I was in Tokyo closing the most important deal of my career up to that point, and Elena had disappeared from my life completely after leaving us both destroyed by a loss that neither of us knew how to process. Yet here was a girl who could have been Elena's daughter, could have been our daughter if things had been different, if I had been different, if I had chosen to be present when she needed me most, if I had put our love above my ambitions, if I had understood that there are things in life that cannot be recovered once they are lost. She looked up then as if she had felt my fixed stare, and our eyes met across the space that separated us, and I saw Elena's eyes looking back at me from a face that was too thin, too sharp, too weathered by life for someone so young, for someone who should have been playing with dolls or doing homework instead of selling newspapers on a dangerous corner to help support her family. Something inside my chest broke like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The sound was almost audible in my head, a cracking that resonated in my ribs, in my lungs, in my heart that had been frozen for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to beat for something more than survival. Newspaper, sir. Her voice was Elena's voice, but pitched higher, thinner, strained by hunger and exhaustion, but with the same musicality, the same way of elongating vowels as if she were singing instead of speaking. I wanted to say something, wanted to do something, wanted to reach out and touch her cheek to make sure she was real, but instead I just stood there like an idiot watching her smile, the same crooked smile that used to make me promise Elena things I couldn't keep, grandiose promises about forever and always and how love would be enough to fix everything broken in the world, promises that sounded beautiful in the moment but that crumbled when real life got between us. The morning had started like any other morning in the past 5 years. I woke up at 5:30 sharp without needing an alarm because my body had grown accustomed to the relentless rhythm of success in my penthouse apartment on the 35th floor of the city's most exclusive building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of a city that stretched endlessly in all directions like an ocean of lights and shadows and lives unfolding without me knowing anything about them. I made coffee with the $3,000 Italian machine that Elena had insisted on buying during our last Christmas together, when we were still pretending that material things could fill the silent spaces between us, when we still believed that if we spent enough money creating the perfect life we could ignore the fact that we no longer knew how to talk to each other. The coffee tasted like nothing, as it always had since Elena left, because it turns out that the taste of things is connected to who you share them with, and when you eat alone or drink alone everything becomes ash in your mouth. I drank it standing by the window, watching people move like ants below, early workers hurrying toward jobs they probably hated but needed to survive, and thinking about the meeting I had scheduled at 9 with the board of directors and how I needed to convince them to approve the merger with Herrera Corporation that would make me even richer than I already was, that would add another $200 million to my net worth, that would place me on the list of the richest men under 40 in the country. Money had always been easy for me since I was a child, selling lemonade in my middle-class neighborhood, and discovered I had a natural instinct for understanding what people wanted and how to give it to them for a price that would give me profit. Making it, keeping it, growing it, expanding it, multiplying it into empires of steel and glass and technology and digital ones and zeros that meant nothing and everything, depending on who was counting, depending on whether you had someone to share success with or if you only had numbers in a bank account that grew every day but never hugged you back. Elena used to say I loved money more than I loved her, and I would deny it, would get defensive, would argue with the passion of someone who knows deep down that the accusation is true, would buy her expensive things, jewelry and dresses and trips to Europe to prove she was wrong. But now, sitting here in the silence of my empty apartment, I wonder if she was right, if maybe I never learned to love something that couldn't be quantified or leveraged or sold on the stock market. The girl folded another newspaper with precise movements, and I watched her small fingers work and remembered Elena's hands when she was 6 months pregnant, when her belly was already round and she would spend hours caressing it, talking to the baby, telling her stories about the world waiting outside, about the places we would visit together, the adventures we would have as a family. I remembered how I used to put my hands on her belly at night and feel the little kicks and promise our unborn daughter that I would be the best father in the world, that I would never disappoint her like my own father had disappointed me with his emotional absence and his obsession with work. But it turned out I was exactly like my father after all. We lost the baby in the 7th month on a Tuesday morning while I was in a conference room in Tokyo negotiating contractual terms that I can't even remember now. Elena lost the baby, I should say, because I wasn't there when it happened, wasn't there when the contractions began, wasn't there when the doctors told her something was wrong, wasn't there when our perfect daughter was born dead with her little fists closed and her eyes that would never open. I was 8,000 miles away drinking sake with Japanese executives and talking about profit projections while my world collapsed and the woman I loved faced any mother's worst nightmare completely alone. By the time I flew back 14 hours later, Elena was a different person, was an empty shell of who she had been before. I found her in the hospital room, staring out the window at the parking lot where life continued normal, where people came and went living their ordinary lives while ours shattered like glass breaking in slow motion, each fragment cutting deeper than the last. "You weren't here," she told me without turning to look at me, her voice flat, emotionless, as if she had spent all her capacity to feel in the last 24 hours. "I came as soon as I could," I told her, but we both knew it wasn't true. We both knew I had finished the meeting first, had shaken hands and signed papers, and had even celebrated with French champagne while she was alone in a room full of machines that couldn't save the small life we had created together. "I'm so sorry, Elena, you don't know how sorry I am. But apologies can't bring back the dead, can't erase absence, can't change the fact that when she needed me most I chose a business meeting over my family. We called her Hope," Elena said, finally turning to look at me, and I saw that her eyes were completely dry, as if she had no tears left. "Because that was all we had, and now we don't even have that." I tried to touch her, but she pulled away as if my contact burned her, and I understood in that moment that I had lost more than my daughter. I had also lost the woman I loved, had lost my chance to be the man I had promised to be. She left 3 months later. She packed her things while I was at a conference in Chicago closing another deal that seemed crucial at the time, and disappeared into the city, leaving only a note written in her perfect handwriting that said she couldn't keep pretending we were a couple when I had clearly demonstrated that my work was more important than our relationship, that she needed to find herself somewhere I wasn't, constantly choosing everything else over her, where she could mourn our daughter without having to see the face of the man who wasn't there when she needed him most. I hired the best private investigators in the city, paid them hundreds of thousands of dollars to track every lead, but Elena had always been smarter than me, had always been better at disappearing when she needed to, had learned since childhood after her parents' death that sometimes survival requires becoming invisible. After 6 months of intensive searching, after following false leads and broken hopes, I gave up and threw myself into work with the kind of desperation that builds fortunes and destroys souls, working 18 hours a day 7 days a week, building a business empire on the bones of my personal life. That was 5 years ago, and since then I hadn't felt anything real until now. Now I was standing on a dirty corner watching a girl who looked exactly like Elena would have looked at 9 years old if she had grown up poor and forgotten and invisible on the streets of this cruel city, and I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't felt since the day Elena packed her suitcases and walked out of my life forever. It was as if something that had been sleeping for years was finally awakening, as if my frozen heart had begun to beat again. The girl approached me with her stack of precisely folded newspapers, and I could see the dirt embedded under her nails that were too short, as if she bit them when nervous, just like Elena used to do, and the way her white sneakers that had once been white held together with silver duct tape and iron determination. I could see the strength in her small shoulders, the dignity in the way she held her head high despite circumstances, the intelligence in her eyes that shone with the light of someone who had learned to read the world and people out of survival necessity. I wanted to reach out and fix everything, wanted to write a check that would solve all her problems, that would give her the childhood she deserved, that would send her to the best private school in the city, that would buy her new clothes and shoes that didn't need duct tape. But I also knew from experience that money was the only tool I had in my emotional toolbox, and sometimes the only tool you have is the wrong tool for the job you need to do. How much for the newspaper? I asked, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, as if I hadn't spoken to a child in years, which was true because I had spent 5 years avoiding any situation that reminded me of what I had lost. 50 cents, sir, she replied with a smile that was pure sunlight, without artifice, without calculation, just the natural joy of a child who had found a potential customer. I reached into my Italian leather wallet that cost more than this family probably earned in a month and pulled out $100 bill fresh from the bank, because I never carried wrinkled bills. It was one of those rich man's quirks I had developed over the years. I watched her eyes widen like saucers as she looked at the money, then at me, then back at the money, as if she couldn't process what she was seeing, as if it were too good to be true. I don't have change for this, sir, she said with an honesty that broke my heart, because in my world people would have taken the money without blinking, would have invented excuses to keep it all, would have seen my generosity as weakness to be exploited. I don't need change, I told her, and I saw her look at me as if I were crazy or dangerous or both, and maybe I was both. Maybe I had been both for so long I had forgotten how to be anything else, how to be the kind of man who helps without expecting anything in return. Keep it all. Are you sure? She asked, and her voice trembled slightly with the emotion of someone who had learned that life rarely offered gifts without strings, that there was always a hidden price to pay later. I'm sure, I told her, and when she smiled I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 5 years, something warm and real and alive. What's your name? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer, though part of me feared the answer, because if it was what I suspected it would mean the universe had a very cruel or very compassionate sense of humor. She hesitated for a moment, and I could see her trying to decide if talking to me was worth the risk, could see the internal battle between the need to be kind to a generous customer and the warnings she had probably been given about talking to strangers, especially rich strangers who seemed too interested in little girls. I realized I was probably the kind of man children are warned about, the kind of man who had too much power, too much money, too much influence, and therefore might want anything, including things he shouldn't want. Carmen, she said finally, with her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that reminded me so much of Elena I had to catch my breath. Carmen, I repeated, and the name felt like a prayer in my mouth, felt like something sacred I wasn't worthy of speaking, like a word that had power, like a name that meant more than either of us understood in that moment. Carmen had been Elena's middle name, the name of her maternal grandmother who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Elena was 12, the strong, independent woman who had taught her that love without respect is worthless, that a woman must be able to support herself before choosing to share her life with someone else. Elena had always said that if we had a daughter we would name her Carmen, in honor of the woman who had given her the strength to survive early loss and build a meaningful life from broken pieces. Carmen is a beautiful name, I told her, and I saw her cheeks flush slightly with the pleasure of being truly seen as a person with value instead of just another street vendor people preferred to ignore. A city bus stopped at the curb with a hiss of hydraulic brakes, and its doors opened with a metallic sound, and people poured out like water from a broken dam. Executives with briefcases, students with backpacks, mothers with strollers, all moving with the desperate haste of a city that never sleeps. Carmen moved away from me, instinctively positioning herself strategically where passengers would have to walk past her, where her voice could reach them before they disappeared into the crowd, and I watched her instantly transform from a shy child into a professional businesswoman, hawking her wares with the confidence of someone who had learned that survival required performance, that sometimes you have to pretend to be stronger than you are to get what you need. Newspapers. Today's news. Only 50 cents, she called out with a voice that rose above the noise of traffic and conversations and the general chaos of urban life. Most people ignored her completely as if she were invisible, as if she were part of the urban furniture, but a few stopped, bought newspapers from her, gave her coins that she counted carefully before storing them in a small cloth purse tied around her waist. I watched each interaction, noticing how her personality changed slightly with each customer, how she became more formal with businessmen, warmer with older women, more playful with young people who looked like college students. I should have walked away then. I should have continued on my way to my office, where my personal assistant had organized my day in 15-minute increments, where financial reports were waiting for my review, where conference calls with international investors were scheduled, where money was being made and lost in amounts that would have fed Carmen's family for years. Instead, I found myself following her at a distance when she finished her morning shift, staying in the shadows like a private detective or like a stalker. I wasn't sure which one I was at this point. She worked from 6 in the morning until noon. I learned by watching over several days that I returned to the same corner like a possessed man, like someone who had found something precious and couldn't stay away from it. Around noon she would pack her remaining newspapers in a worn plastic bag and begin walking toward the old part of the city where colonial buildings leaned against each other like drunk friends after a night of partying, and the streets were narrow and filled with the smell of food cooking on gas stoves and poverty that had settled into the stones after generations of struggle and resignation. I followed her, keeping enough distance not to alarm her but close enough not to lose her in the maze of alleys and passages that made up the historic heart of the city. I felt like a predator, felt like someone who had crossed an invisible line, but was unable to stop myself, unable to turn away from this girl who had Elena's face and Elena's voice and Elena's way of moving through the world with quiet dignity, despite everything trying to break her, to bend her, to force her to give up. She turned into an alley I wouldn't have entered without an armed bodyguard, a narrow passage between two apartment buildings that looked like they might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. The walls were covered with graffiti in Spanish, some words of love, others of political protest, others simply names of young people who wanted to leave evidence that they had existed, had been there, had mattered enough for someone to remember their names. I watched from the alley entrance as she climbed a rusty fire escape that groaned under her light weight until she reached a window on the third floor of a building that looked like a postcard of urban poverty. Through the open window I could see fragments of her interior life, worn curtains that had once been blue, a white plastic table with one leg shorter than the others stabilized with old books, a small television that flickered with poor reception. I saw Carmen move inside the apartment, hanging her bag on a hook by the door, taking off her shoes and putting on pink rubber flip-flops that were so worn they barely had soles. I saw an older woman, probably her grandmother, sitting in a wheelchair by the window with a blanket over her legs despite the midday heat, and Carmen went to her, immediately gave her a kiss on the forehead, showed her the money she had earned that morning. I stood there in my $3,000 suit, feeling like an intruder in a world that existed parallel to mine but might as well have been on another planet, in another galaxy, in another dimension, where the rules were completely different, where survival required creativity and resistance instead of contacts and capital, where love was measured in shared time and sacrifices made instead of expensive gifts and empty promises. My phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, one text message after another from my assistant, reminding me about the board meeting, reminding me that 18 very important people were waiting for my presence, reminding me that there were millions of dollars at stake, reminding me that I had responsibilities I couldn't simply abandon because I had seen my ex-wife's ghost in the face of a poor girl. I looked down at the bright screen full of numbers and meetings and obligations, then up at the window where Carmen had disappeared into the shadows of her home, and I realized I had a decision to make, a decision that could change the course of my life, or could be just another whim of a rich man who had too much time and too much money and too much unresolved guilt. For the first time in 5 years the decision felt like it really mattered, felt like it could change something fundamental about who I was and who I might become, felt like it could be the difference between continuing to be the man who had lost everything that mattered or becoming someone capable of building something new on the ruins of what I had destroyed. I walked back to my office, but the journey felt like walking through molasses, each step more difficult than the last, each block an eternity. The glass and steel building where I had my office on the 40th floor rose toward the sky like a monument to human ambition, like a declaration of power that could be seen from miles away. I took the private elevator to my floor, passing by the levels where my employees worked, where the lives of hundreds of people who depended on the decisions I made in meetings like the one I was about to have unfolded. My office was a work of art in modern minimalism, all clean lines and marble surfaces and windows that offered a panoramic view of the city stretching to the horizon. Behind my solid ebony desk hung a Harvard diploma and several industry awards, and a photograph of me shaking hands with the president at some charity event I had attended, not because I cared about the cause but because it was good for business. But I couldn't concentrate on the meeting, couldn't focus on the PowerPoint presentations about market share and profit margins and quarterly projections that normally fascinated me, because all I could think about was Carmen's face and the way she had looked at me when I gave her the money as if I were some kind of angel or miracle, and the way she had said her name as if it were something precious she was entrusting to me, something that could break if I didn't handle it carefully. The executive spoke in corporate jargon about synergies and optimization and restructuring while I looked out the window at the city and wondered where Carmen was at this moment, if she was eating lunch at that plastic table with her grandmother, if she had enough food, if there was money for medicine, if she knew how to read, if she had ever had a storybook, if anyone had ever told her she was intelligent and beautiful and deserved something better than selling newspapers on a dangerous corner. The merger was approved unanimously after 3 hours of discussion and analysis, and normally it would have been the highest point of my week. I would have celebrated, would have called my broker to review how this would affect my portfolio, would have taken my team to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the city, but instead I sat in my office after everyone had gone home and watched the city lights beginning to turn on like terrestrial stars, and wondered what Elena would think if she knew I had found someone who looked exactly like her, that I had followed that someone home like some kind of broken-hearted stalker, that I was considering decisions that would have seemed unthinkable a week ago. I picked up the phone and dialed Elena's number, the same number I had dialed hundreds of times in the past 5 years, always knowing I would hear the same automated recording telling me the number was no longer in service, always hoping against hope that maybe this time would be different. It had become a masochistic ritual, this nightly call to a dead number, as if pain were the only thing connecting me to what we had shared, as if I needed to remind myself what I had lost to keep functioning, to keep building this empire of money and success on the bones of my personal life. But this time something extraordinary happened. This time, instead of the familiar recording that had consoled and tortured me for 5 years, the phone rang. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and I sat there in my Italian leather chair looking at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake, as if it were something that could kill me or save me, and I wasn't sure which of the 2 options I preferred. And then Elena answered. Hello. Her voice was exactly the same and exactly different, was familiar like a song you had heard 1,000 times, but strange, as if it were coming from far away, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well or from another world. It was the sound of everything I had lost and everything I might still have a chance to find, was the voice that had whispered I love you on Sunday mornings when the world was perfect, and also the voice that had screamed at me that I was never present, that I always chose work over us, that I had killed our marriage with my indifference disguised as ambition. I sat there in my expensive apartment holding my expensive phone, wearing my expensive clothes, surrounded by all the things I had bought to fill the void Elena had left, and I couldn't say anything, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but listen to her breathing on the other end of the line and wonder if this was real, or if I had finally gone crazy, if 5 years of guilt and regret had finally broken something irreparable in my mind. Hello? She said again, and this time I could hear something in her voice that could have been hope, or could have been fear, or could have been both, could have been the same confusion. I was feeling the same sensation that the universe had just rearranged all its rules without consulting us first. Elena, I said finally, and the word came out like a prayer, like a confession, like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, like a name I hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years because it hurt too much, because every time I said it felt like opening a wound that had never completely healed. There was a silence so long I thought she had hung up, but then I heard her breathing again, soft and irregular, as if she were trying to decide whether to talk to me or cut the call, as if she were weighing 5 years of silence against the possibility that maybe we had suffered enough, maybe it was time to try something different. How did you get this number? She asked finally, and her voice was cautious, controlled, but I could detect an almost imperceptible tremor that told me this had affected her as much as me, that she too was struggling with ghosts and memories and the impossible question of whether some wounds can really heal or if we simply learn to live with the pain. I called your old number, I told her, which was true but not complete, was honest but not the whole truth, was the beginning of a conversation that could save me or destroy me, or both. The same number I've been calling for 5 years. I just changed it back last week, she said, and I could hear something in her voice that could have been laughter, or could have been crying, or could have been that strange thing that happens when pain and joy mix in ways that have no name. After 5 years of running from my own life, I decided it was time to face the ghosts. Where have you been? I asked, though I wasn't sure I had the right to know, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer, because it might include other men, other lives, other versions of Elena that had flourished in places where I couldn't hurt her. Here and there, she said evasively. Portland for a while, then Denver. I worked at an art gallery in Santa Fe for 2 years. I taught art at an elementary school in Austin. I kept moving because every place felt temporary, as if I were waiting for something to change, as if I were waiting for a sign to tell me where I belonged. And now I'm back in the city, she said, and her voice softened slightly as if admitting this were a kind of surrender. I've been here 6 months working as a teacher at a school in the South District teaching art to children who have never had the chance to create something beautiful, teaching them that the world can be more than survival, that it can be expression and beauty and hope. The South District. The same neighborhood where I had seen Carmen, where this strange obsession that had led me to dial this number again had begun. The universe seemed to be playing a complicated game with me, or maybe it was finally offering me a chance at redemption disguised as coincidence. Elena, I began, but didn't know how to continue, didn't know how to reduce 5 years of regret and pain and growth to words that could fit in a phone conversation, didn't know how to explain that I had seen her face in a newspaper selling girl and that had changed something fundamental in me. I have to tell you something, I said, finally deciding that brutal honesty was the only tool I had that might work. Something strange has been happening. I told her about Carmen in minute detail, about the way she looked exactly like Elena, about the way she had smiled at me, about the way she had said her name as if it were something precious and fragile. I told her about following her home, about seeing her life of poverty, about feeling something awaken in my chest that had been dead for 5 years. I told her about the questions it had made me ask, about the kind of man I wanted to be, about whether it was possible to really change, or if we were all doomed to repeat our mistakes over and over until we died alone and full of regret. Elena was quiet for so long I thought the call had been cut, but then I heard her take a deep breath like someone preparing to dive into deep and dangerous waters. "What age did you say she was?" she asked, and there was something in her voice I couldn't identify, something that felt like fear or hope or possibility, or all three things mixed into an emotion that had no name. 9, maybe 10 years old, I repeated. Why? Another long heavy silence, as if she were calculating dates in her head, as if she were reaching a conclusion that scared and excited her at the same time. "I need to see you," she said finally, and her voice had an urgency I hadn't heard before, an intensity that made me straighten in my chair. "I need to see this girl." "Why?" I asked, though I think I already knew the answer, though part of me had been avoiding the obvious possibility, the explanation that would make all of this make perfect and terrible sense. "Because," Elena said, and I could hear tears in her voice now, could hear years of pain and secrets and impossible decisions. "Because I think Carmen might be our daughter." The world stopped. Not metaphorically, but literally. It felt as if the planet had stopped spinning, as if time had frozen, as if the entire universe were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. My phone felt heavy in my hand, as if it were made of lead. Elena's words echoed in my head like bells, like explosions, like the sound the world makes when it completely reorganizes itself in the space of a single sentence. "What?" was all I could say. My voice came out as a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break this bubble of impossible possibility. "She didn't die," Elena said, and now she was crying openly, her voice broken by 5 years of a secret that must have weighed on her like a mountain. "The doctors told me she had died, but she was alive, weak but alive. They had to put her in intensive care for weeks. You weren't there, and I didn't know what to do. I was alone and scared and furious with you for not being there when I needed you most. But you told me." I began, but my voice faded because I realized I had never seen the body, had never been to a funeral, had never done any of the things a father does when he loses a child, because I had trusted Elena to tell me the truth, because I had assumed my pain was the same as her pain. "I lied to you," she said, and the words came out like a confession, like a sin she had been carrying for 5 years. "I was so angry, so hurt, because you weren't there. When you finally called from Tokyo, I had already made the decision. The doctor said she had developmental problems, that she might need special care her whole life, that it would be expensive and difficult, and I knew you would choose money over her just like you chose money over me. Elena, I can't, this can't be real. I gave her up for adoption," she continued, as if the words had been waiting 5 years to come out, as if she had finally found the strength to tell the complete truth. "To a family I thought could give her a better life than anything we could offer her. But things didn't turn out as I expected. The adoptive father died when she was 5, and the mother couldn't cope alone. Carmen ended up with her biological grandmother, an older woman living in poverty but who loves her unconditionally." My head was spinning, trying to process information that didn't fit into any category my mind could understand. Our daughter was alive, had been alive all this time, had been living less than 5 miles from my office, selling newspapers on a corner while I built empires and accumulated wealth and convinced myself that pain was all I had left of our love. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange, distant, as if it were coming from far away. "Because I've been living with this lie for 5 years and it's slowly killing me," Elena said. "Because every day that passes is another day our daughter grows up without knowing her father. Because when you described that girl I knew the universe is giving us a second chance and it would be a crime not to take it. How can you be sure it's her? Carmen Elena Herrera, Elena said, and I could hear the sad smile in her voice. That's her full name. I named her Carmen after my grandmother and Elena after me, but I gave her the surname Herrera, which was the maiden name of the woman who adopted her. She has a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her left wrist just below the thumb. I closed my eyes and tried to remember if I had seen anything like that when Carmen had handed me the newspaper when she had counted coins in her palm. I had been so focused on her face, on the way she looked like Elena, that I hadn't paid attention to other details, but now that I thought about it I remembered a small dark spot on her wrist that I had assumed was dirt or maybe a bruise. I need to see her again, I said, though I wasn't sure what I would do if Elena was right, if Carmen really was our daughter, if the last 5 years of my life had been built on a lie. I need to be sure. Me too, Elena said. Can you meet me tomorrow? At the corner where you saw her? Yes, I said without hesitation, though I knew this would mean canceling important meetings, losing money, disappointing investors, but for the first time in 5 years there was something more important than business. What time? 7 in the morning, she said. Before many people arrive, before she gets scared seeing us together. Elena, I said, and her name felt different in my mouth now, felt like a promise, like a possibility, like the beginning of something that could be beautiful or terrible or both. What if you're right? What if she really is our daughter? Then, Elena said, in her voice filled with a determination I recognized from the old days when she decided something was important enough to fight for, then we'll have to figure out how to be the parents she deserves. We'll have to figure out how to fix 5 years of mistakes. We'll have to figure out if love is enough to heal the wounds we've caused. And us? I asked, though I wasn't sure I had the right to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. What about us? I don't know, she said honestly. It's been 5 years. We're different people now. But if Carmen really is our daughter, then we'll have to find a way to be a family, even if it can't be the way we once dreamed. We talked for another 2 hours, filling in the blanks of 5 years of separate lives. Elena told me about the jobs she had had, the places she had lived, the men she had met but could never love completely because part of her was always reserved for the memory of what we had lost. I told her about the businesses I had built, the money I had earned, the women I had dated but who never meant anything because my heart had been buried with what I thought was our dead daughter. I told her about nights when I would wake up sweating from nightmares, about babies crying in empty rooms, about mornings when I would see children in the park and have to walk away because the pain was too intense, about how I had built my entire life around avoiding any reminder of what we had lost. She told me about visiting Carmen in secret during her early years, about sending money anonymously to the adoptive family, about letters she had written but never sent, about photographs she had taken from far away like a spy documenting the growth of her own daughter. Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? I asked finally, the question that had been burning in my throat throughout the entire conversation. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you wouldn't care, afraid you would choose money over her just like you chose money over me. Afraid you would be a bad father, afraid I would be a bad mother, afraid we would hurt her more than we had already hurt everything. And now I think we all deserve a second chance, she said. I think Carmen deserves to know her father. I think you deserve the chance to be the man you always wanted to be. And I think I deserve the chance to stop carrying this secret that has been slowly killing me for 5 years. When we finally hung up, it was almost 3 in the morning and I sat in my apartment in the darkness looking at the city lights and feeling something I hadn't felt in 5 years, something that could have been hope or could have been terror or could have been both. The world looked different through my windows, as if it had changed color during our conversation, as if the possibility that Carmen was my daughter had reorganized reality in ways I couldn't yet completely understand. I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake until dawn thinking about names and dates and coincidences that now seemed less like coincidences and more like destiny. I thought about Carmen counting coins in her palm and wondered if she had my hands, if she had my way of frowning when concentrating, if she had any part of me mixed with all the Elena I could see in her face. I thought about 5 years of unnecessary pain, 5 years of a life built on a lie, 5 years of a daughter growing up without knowing her father while her father went mad with grief over a death that had never occurred. It was too cruel to be coincidence, too perfect to be accident, too impossible to be real, and yet here I was living in this strange intersection between tragedy and miracle. At 6 in the morning I showered and dressed more carefully than I had dressed for any business meeting, choosing a suit that wouldn't intimidate, shoes that weren't too obviously expensive, a tie that didn't scream wealth. For the first time in years I cared about the impression I would make not on investors or business partners but on a 9-year-old girl who might be my daughter and on a woman I had once loved more than my own life. The journey to the subway felt like walking toward my execution or toward my resurrection, I wasn't sure which. Every traffic light, every corner, every step brought me closer to a moment that could change everything or could prove I had completely lost my mind, that I had built an elaborate fantasy around a superficial resemblance between an unknown girl and the woman who had destroyed my life by leaving. I arrived at the corner at 6:45 and Carmen was already there organizing her newspapers with the same precision I had observed for days. But this time everything looked different, every gesture loaded with possibility, every movement examined for family similarities, every facial expression analyzed to find traces of my own face mixed with Elena's. Elena arrived exactly at 7, walking from the opposite direction with cautious steps as if the ground might open under her feet at any moment. She looked older, there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. 5 years of secrets and guilt had left marks on her face, but she was still beautiful, still the woman I had fallen in love with, still Elena. Our eyes met across the distance and for a moment it was as if the last 5 years vanished, as if we were again the people we had been before everything broke, before life taught us that love isn't enough to overcome all difficulties, before we learned that sometimes the best intentions can create the worst results. And then Elena saw Carmen and her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry that could have been pain or could have been joy or could have been the sound a mother makes when she sees the daughter she thought she had lost forever. Carmen looked at us with curiosity, probably wondering why 2 well-dressed adults were standing on her corner at 7 in the morning looking at her as if she were a miracle or a ghost or both. "Hello, Carmen," Elena said with a voice that trembled with 5 years of unshed tears. "Hello," Carmen replied, cautiously recognizing me but not knowing who this woman was who looked at her with an intensity that probably scared her. "Carmen," Elena said, kneeling to be at eye level with the girl, "can I see your wrist?" Carmen looked at me as if asking permission and I nodded, though my heart was beating so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. Carmen extended her left arm and Elena took her small hand with a delicacy that was almost religious. There it was on her wrist just below the thumb, a small crescent-shaped birthmark so perfect it looked drawn by an artist, so distinctive it couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Elena began to cry, then silent tears that fell down her cheeks as she held our daughter's hand, the daughter who had been alive all this time, the daughter we had lost and found again in the space of a week, that had changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. "Carmen," Elena said with a voice that was barely a whisper, "I'm your mother." And in that moment, standing on a dirty corner on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the world completely reorganized itself again, and I knew nothing would ever be the same, that we had crossed an invisible line into territory where the rules were completely different, where everything was possible, where broken families could be repaired if they had enough love and enough time and enough forgiveness for the terrible decisions people make when they're scared and hurt and alone. Carmen looked at Elena and me with eyes that widened with gradual understanding, with an intelligence I recognized as mine mixed with an emotional sensitivity that was pure Elena, and I knew without a doubt that we had found what we didn't know we were looking for, that the universe had given us a second chance disguised as a newspaper selling girl on a city corner we had been avoiding for 5 years. "My dad?" Carmen asked, looking at me with an expression that contained all the hope and all the fear that can fit in a child's heart. "Yes," I said, and the word came out like a promise, like an oath, like the beginning of everything we would have to learn about being a family. "I'm your dad." And when Carmen dropped her newspapers and ran toward me with open arms, I felt my frozen heart finally completely thaw, felt 5 years of pain transform into something that could be joy or could be redemption or could be simply the beginning of the most difficult and most beautiful part of my life. Her small arms wrapped around my waist with a strength I didn't expect from someone so small, and I buried my face in her hair that smelled of cheap shampoo and hope and all the mornings we had lost, all the breakfasts we hadn't shared, all the bedtime stories I had never told her. Elena approached slowly, as if afraid to break this fragile moment, as if after 5 years of secrets she wasn't sure if she had the right to be part of this reunion she herself had made possible. "I'm not going to leave again," I whispered in Carmen's ear, and felt her small shoulders tremble with silent crying that broke my heart and repaired it at the same time. "I'm never going to leave you alone again." But even as I spoke the words, I knew promises were fragile, that good intentions weren't always enough, that we would have to learn how to be a family from scratch, as if we were strangers who shared DNA but not history, as if love were something we had to build brick by brick instead of something that simply existed because we were blood of the same blood. "We need to talk," Elena said, and her voice had a practical quality I recognized from the old days when she was the one who thought about details while I got lost in big ideas. "Carmen lives with her grandmother Maria, who is sick and knows nothing about us. Her adoptive mother Esperanza comes to visit once a month and gives money for expenses, but it's not enough. Carmen sells newspapers every day to buy medicine for Maria to pay rent to buy food. The practical reality of the situation began to filter through the euphoria of the moment. We couldn't simply take Carmen as if she were an object we had lost and found. We had to navigate a world of relationships and responsibilities and people who loved her in their limited but real way. We had to face the fact that for 5 years other people had been her family while we lived in separate worlds built on lies and misunderstandings. What do we do? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer, though part of me was already calculating how much money we would need to fix the immediate situation to ensure Carmen never again had to sell newspapers on a dangerous corner to survive. First, Elena said with the voice of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time, we have to meet Maria and Esperanza. We have to explain who we are and why we suddenly appeared in Carmen's life. We have to earn their trust and prove we're not going to hurt Carmen more than she has already been hurt. And then we have to figure out what kind of parents we're going to be, Elena said, looking at me with an intensity that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. We have to decide if we can do this together or if we have to find a way to co-parent our daughter without emotionally killing each other in the process. Carmen watched us go back and forth in conversation as if she were watching a tennis match, but I could see in her eyes that she understood more than we were saying, that she had developed the sharp intuition children develop when they have to navigate complicated adult worlds from a very early age. Are you going to fight? She asked in a small voice that made me realize she had probably seen many fights between adults who were supposed to take care of her, had learned to read signs of emotional tension as a survival skill. No, Elena and I said at the same time, and then we looked at each other with something that could have been surprise, that we agreed on something that after 5 years of silence and resentment we could still speak in unison as if some part of us remembered how to be a couple. We're not going to fight, I repeated, kneeling to be at Carmen's level. Your mom and I are going to learn how to do this right. It's going to take time and it's going to be complicated, but we're not going to fight with you. But are you going to fight with each other? She asked with the logical persistence of a child who had learned that adults often didn't tell the whole truth, that there were hidden words behind the words that were spoken. Elena and I looked at each other again, and I saw in her eyes the same question that was burning in my own mind. Could we do this? Could we set aside 5 years of pain and guilt and resentment long enough to be the parents Carmen needed? Or had we changed too much, hurt too much, grown in two different directions to find a way to function as a family? Maybe, Elena said honestly. Adults sometimes fight when they're trying to solve big problems. But if we fight, it won't be your fault and we'll always resolve our problems because you're more important than anything we could disagree about. Carmen nodded as if this were an answer she could understand and accept, as if she had learned that complicated honesty was better than simple promises that broke when life got difficult. Do I have to stop selling newspapers? She asked, and I could hear hope and fear mixed in her voice. Hope that maybe her life could be easier, fear that maybe she was losing the only identity she knew, the only way she knew how to contribute to her survival. Yes, I said without hesitation. You never have to sell newspapers again. You never have to worry about money or food or medicine for your grandmother. That's my responsibility now. I'm your father and my job is to make sure you have everything you need. But what am I going to do? She asked with genuine confusion, as if she couldn't imagine a life without adult responsibilities, as if she didn't know what it meant to simply be a child. You're going to go to school, Elena said gently. You're going to make friends and learn new things and play and create art and read books and do all the things children your age do when they don't have to worry about surviving. Really? Really? I said, and I felt the weight of the promise as I made it, felt the responsibility to change not just Carmen's life but my own life in ways I couldn't yet completely imagine. And you're going to have your own room and toys and new clothes and everything you want. But even as I said the words, I realized Carmen probably needed more than material things, needed time and patience and the kind of love that is built day by day through small moments of connection and trust. She needed parents who knew how to be parents, and Elena and I were complete novices at this, were people who had lost 5 years of practice, who had to learn how to love a girl who already had her own personality, her own fears, her own ways of navigating the world. Where am I going to live? Carmen asked with the practical logic of someone who had learned that big changes always came with complications that adults didn't always explain clearly. Elena and I looked at each other again, and I saw in her eyes the same question that was forming in my mind, together or separately. Could we rebuild not just our relationship with Carmen but our relationship with each other? Or was it too late for that? Had we damaged too much? Had we grown in two different directions? For now, Elena said carefully, we're going to take things day by day. We're going to meet your grandmother Maria and we're going to make sure she has the best medical care possible. We're going to fix your housing situation so it's safe and comfortable. And we're going to spend time together, the three of us, to get to know each other again, to learn how to be a family. And after? Carmen asked with the persistence of someone who had learned that the future was uncertain, that adults often made promises they couldn't keep, that it was better to understand exactly what to expect. After, I said, taking Carmen's small hand in one of mine and extending the other toward Elena, who took it after a moment of hesitation, we're going to build something new. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's going to be ours, and it's going to be full of love, and it's going to be enough. Elena squeezed my hand, and for a moment I felt the echo of what we had been together, felt the possibility of what we might become, not as a reconstruction of our past but as something completely new, built on a foundation of forgiveness and growth, and the understanding that sometimes second chances come disguised as tragedies that turn out to be miracles. The three of us stood there on the corner where it had all begun, surrounded by the noise and chaos of the city waking up, but creating our own small circle of silence and possibility. Carmen's newspapers lay scattered on the pavement like leaves the wind had carried away, abandoned because she no longer needed them, because her life had just changed in ways none of us could completely understand yet. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, and it wasn't clear if she meant ready to meet Maria, or ready to change our lives completely, or ready to embark on the most terrifying and beautiful adventure of our lives. "Yes," I said, though I wasn't sure I was ready for anything, though I knew some things don't wait until you're ready, that sometimes you have to jump and hope love is strong enough to teach you how to fly. Carmen squeezed our hands and began walking toward her home, toward Maria, toward the first conversation of many difficult conversations we would have to have, toward the beginning of everything we would have to learn about being a family. And as we walked through the narrow streets of the neighborhood where our daughter had grown up without us, I felt something I hadn't felt in 5 years, felt that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to do, being exactly who I was supposed to be. The morning sun filtered between buildings, creating patterns of light and shadow on the cracked pavement, and for the first time in years the future felt like something to walk toward instead of something to run from. This was only the first part of a story that would take years to tell completely, but as I walked between Elena and Carmen toward the unknown, I knew that no matter how difficult it became, no matter how many mistakes we made, no matter how much we had to learn about love and forgiveness and family, we had found something worth all the risks. We had found our way back to each other. And that was enough to begin.